Hello and welcome to the ITF's Ask the Author session on Lightening the Load, integrating light cargo vehicles in cities. This is the first Ask the Author session of 2026. We're delighted to see so many of you joining us in the room today. If this is your first Ask the Author session, we are running a 30-minute quick-fire session to give you an overview of the issue, the methodology, and the findings of the subject in question. And then it's over to you to ask the questions, and our experts are on hand to take as many of your questions as possible. To do so, please use the question and answer, the Q&A function in your Zoom window. If you're on LinkedIn or YouTube and you'd like to ask us a question, click on the register link and pop into our Zoom window. So I'm delighted today to be joined by John P. Pritchard, Philippe Christ, and Sarah McBain, who are the authors of the report, which went live in December 2025. This is the last ITF Corporate Partnership Board report of 2025, and we look forward to more of that as we go forward during the year. So without further ado, we'll have a very brief overview of the issue and the findings from Philippe and Sarah, and then it's over to you to ask your questions. So over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Ronan, and thank you all for attending. We're going to talk about light freight mobility in cities, and the reasons we're going to talk about that is that every day, approximately 30% of all vehicle travel in urban areas concerns goods and materials. It's those urban logistics that enable cities to function and to thrive. But these movements can erode the very benefits that people and firms seek in cities. Now, against this backdrop and with the rapid acceleration of e-commerce and parcel delivery, many commercial delivery companies and public authorities are trialing and deploying a wide range of cargo carrying vehicles. What these vehicles share in common is that they are smaller, lighter, and less impactful than the vans and trucks that currently ensure last mile delivery in cities. Smaller than van, let me just move to the next slide. Smaller than van light freight vehicles, such as cargo bikes and other small motorized and non-motorized alternatives, are visible in many cities. But unlike vans and trucks, they are not uniformly classified nor consistently regulated across jurisdictions. And this slows their uptake even when conditions support their use. The last mile of parcel delivery distribution typically rests on the use of small to large vans. These provide good delivery volume to operational cost ratios, but contribute to and are subject to congestion in dense urban areas. Increasingly, their use may also be limited by urban access rules and lack of unloading spaces and bays. Now, a range of smaller and more flexible motorized and increasingly electrified vehicles allow delivery companies to overcome some of those limitations in vans, and these that have already been deployed in many contexts, with, for example, a heavy presence of delivery trikes in many countries and a strong penetration of low-speed electric vehicles in China and or K-class delivery vans in Japan. And there's the return of the cargo bike in a wide range of historic and emerging form factors. This is a clear signal that there is both hunger for smaller and more environmentally friendly delivery vehicles and manufacturers that are willing to supply them. But here's the thing. Our work shows that there is little regulatory alignment on what constitutes a cargo bike or a smaller than van vehicle. And this complicates the uptake of these, be it for longer term vehicle fleet investments, for operators, for insurance purposes, or just for the assurance that these vehicles will be consistently treated in regulation over their lifetimes. It also complicates the promotion and use of these vehicles from a public authority perspective. This has been particularly problematic for determining what constitutes a cargo bike. In many jurisdictions around the world, there is a lack of clarity on what exactly is a cargo bike, and even within single countries, these definitions might differ. Within the European Union, the recent adoption of the cargo bike safety standard, EN 17860, classifying cargo bikes into 3 categories alongside cargo trailers, is an important step forwards, especially as this classification may serve as a reference in non-EU context as well. And likewise, motorized smaller than van vehicles are classified into different categories under the UNECE Working Party 29 framework, according to characteristics like the number of wheels, the power, weight, and dimensions of these vehicles. This taxonomy differentiates vehicles according to their design characteristics, but this aligns only indirectly to the kind of outcomes that are important to citizens and to public authorities like safety or environmental performance. And that latter point is essential to consider when determining how operators and authorities can match vehicle classes to outcomes they want to achieve in line with local context. Over to Sarah.
Thanks, Philippe. So now we're going to talk about factors that impact incorporating light cargo delivery in cities. So first of all, we know that logistics operators consider various factors when thinking about what delivery vehicles to deploy and use and which match their needs. So first of all, does the vehicle itself have characteristics that are going to meet their operational needs? So vehicle-related factors like payload, for example, speed. These are important considerations for operators when selecting delivery vehicles. There's then operator-related factors. So, for example, an operator's hubbing strategy or maybe their distribution model. These kinds of factors are going to influence the types of vehicles that they might select. Looking a little bit more broadly, there's contextual factors. So these impact an operator's choice of vehicle where conditions like density or infrastructure availability, these conditions are going to impact how well certain delivery vehicles are going to perform over others. And this is precisely where policymakers can have the most influence. So policymakers can create contexts that make light cargo vehicles more or less advantageous operationally for logistics operators. And so how do policymakers create those contexts? What are context-changing policies? So authorities can manage curb access, so creating conditions like designated or preferential access to curb space that optimizes the use of light cargo vehicles. Authorities can support the development of off-street facilities, so this can be zoning or regulating in a way that allows for the use of micro-hubs or designating space for that. We know that the characteristics and design of street infrastructure is important, so traffic calming measures, setting speed limits, these can act as invisible infrastructure that are going to help encourage smaller delivery vehicles as well. And then lastly here, urban access restrictions, these help manage the types of vehicles that have access to and within a defined area. So authorities can create zones using restrictions that will help promote lighter cargo vehicles. So low or zero emission zones, for example. And now just to touch on some of the key recommendations that come with this report. So first of all, integrating freight logistics within urban planning is fundamental. There's sustainable urban logistics plans, freight efficient land use programs. Both of these are tools that authorities can use to incorporate freight into broader mobility planning and land use planning. So cities have used these frameworks to implement zoning, infrastructure, or other regulatory measures that take on a more comprehensive approach to mobility planning and more appropriately support the needs of freight in cities. There's also size and weight-based incentives, so such things as access to priority bays, road infrastructure like cycle lanes, urban zones. These can encourage smaller freight vehicles, and these are really the kinds of measures that build that kind of supportive context where light freight vehicles become an advantageous vehicle choice from an operational performance perspective. And as mentioned, so authorities can develop vehicle classifications that are going to reflect their policy goals. They can clearly set rules and rights for each vehicle type, and they can do so in a way that aligns with their objectives when it comes to addressing space use, congestion, safety, health, environmental impact. And they can map these domestic standards to best-in-class frameworks, which is going to help to address a lack of harmonization when it comes to classification schemes and it'll also help to promote greater market development. So we know that small cargo operations are, to be effective, the presence of logistics hubs is really important. So authorities can facilitate the development of these spaces by making sure that zoning allows for their use, and also by dedicating street and off-street spaces to these types of centers. Lastly, so there's an opportunity here as authorities create these kinds of contexts to encourage the adoption of light cargo vehicles to also steer the market towards providing fair and safe jobs. So standards on training, fair employment, and pay, these types of measures are going to help companies that are offering decent green jobs be favored when it comes to public procurement and investment. And then engagement with companies and workers is also important in delivering safe working environments. This can look like more collaboratively designing street infrastructure, or perhaps using engagement to better inform road safety enforcement, for example. And that's all for the presentation, and I believe we'll be able to move into the question and answer period now. So, thank you.
Right, thank you indeed, Philippe and Sarah, for a very concise presentation on a very complicated topic. Now it's over to our participants. It's your chance to ask your questions. Please use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window to ask, so we can moderate as many questions as possible. There's a link to the full report in the chat, and there's also a link to a 2024 ITF report on the final frontier of urban logistics, which focuses on tackling the last meter of deliveries. So to get the ball rolling, we have a question which is asking for an example, basically, in some ways that cities have incorporated logistics within their planning processes to facilitate the use of these smaller than van type vehicles. Do we have clear examples of policies that are working and rollout of these policies?
Yeah, I can help in sort of providing some examples for where cities have incorporated logistics into their planning processes. And I'll share some of the examples that are actually presented in the appendix of the report. So just, I guess, first of all, looking at the Netherlands, if we look at Rotterdam as an example, authorities introduced there a zero-emission zone for freight logistics. But I want to point to the process that helps support that. So in their planning process, they really informed the development of that zone through real and sustained engagement with the private sector. And that included developing a covenant, sort of like a formal agreement with 75 partners to support the implementation of that zone, and also to support complementary measures which were going to help to reduce emissions from freight logistics in the city. And as another example, I'll point to, so in London, their planning process was heavily reliant on gathering and making great use of freight activity data. And that helped develop various planning procedures when it comes to freight logistics, and continues to be sort of foundational when they come to creating freight data reports and using that information to update actions that are in their cargo bike action plan. So these two examples sort of illustrate when I talked about sustainable urban logistics plans or freight efficient land use planning, the importance of using data, but also engagement with the private sector when it comes to creating sort of tailored measures, or measures that are really going to be effective.
Thanks indeed, Sarah. So a question from Anik Roitnik. Anik says that the most important obstruction for light sustainable logistic vehicles in the EU is inadequate and inaccurate technical legislation, which is by no means designed for these vehicles. Is this issue in any way included in the report's recommendations, or indeed do the authors have a comment on the legislation?
So first of all, welcome Anik from Leva EU. one of the premier associations looking at the use of small vehicles in cities in Europe, in cities and elsewhere in Europe. And clearly, Anik, that is a key barrier and challenge to overcome. And it's not unique to Europe. It's something that we found in looking across different jurisdictions in China, in North America, in Japan, as well as in Europe. And the main takeaway from that is that while there are international movements to try to harmonize regulations, harmonize technical design characteristics, until those technical design characteristics are usable in local or urban freight and logistics plans, and until these design characteristics make sense to public authorities who are trying to design for specific outcomes like safety and reduced space consumption, then they won't be of much use. And so we really advocate for trying to find a way to bridge the gap between these technical design taxonomies, which, as you say, are fragmented, and usable taxonomies for local authorities to apply on the ground. And so that's a secondary challenge. I will say that in Europe, for all the fragmentation there is probably more movement afoot to create that environment than we have seen around in other jurisdictions in the world.
Thanks indeed, Philippe. A question from an anonymous attendee. We do take anonymous questions. If you're feeling shy, you don't need to give your name. Who asks, on the industry perspective, how is the logistics industry engaging in the development of light cargo bicycles for urban deliveries? And what role can public authorities play in creating the conditions, regulatory, financial, or infrastructural, that would increase demand for them? So light cargo bicycles for urban deliveries, who would like to take that question?
I can give a take, but John, do you want to give a take as well?
Yeah, maybe I can start off with a little bit of an answer on sort of when you have these incentives for the private sector. I think the most important thing is that these have to be sort of sustainable sort of incentives. They cannot be short-term incentives, because if there's a short-term incentive and the business sort of a case for using a particular type of vehicle is not there in the long term, that's not going to be a very good incentive to kind of get these private actors to come into cities. So when you're talking about sort of how you can encourage the use of these vehicles, it has to be through long-standing and like providing these private actors with a clear idea, certainty that this is the direction we're moving. So I think when you're talking about sort of implementing certain types of infrastructure development, introducing access zones, they have to know that sort of these things are here to stay and that the rug isn't going to be pulled out from under them in the short term or in the medium term. So I think this is the biggest thing, is they can provide certainty. They can bring in the right sort of long-standing policy into place. And I think a key thing to this is if we want to use bikes in cities, we need to have these sort of urban distribution centers or urban sort of micro hubs, which we call in the report. And for this to come in, we need to have sort of land use policies that allow them to kind of act in this way. And you have to find ways to incentivize sort of and counteract their higher costs, especially in the short term, because since they're located in urban areas, they're much more expensive than distribution centers are usually located outside of cities. And Philippe, if you have anything else.
I was just going to say that, building on what Anik suggested in her question, that the fragmentation in approaching these vehicles does not provide that long-term environment in which different kinds of both manufacturers, but also the logistics companies can invest. Because as John said, if there's no clarity that this vehicle class will be treated in the same way over the lifetime of that investment, then it disincentivizes the investment. Now, this said, a lot of companies are, of course, purchasing these vehicles and deploying them in the fleets. And they're doing this because in those specific contexts where they are useful, they are tremendously useful and address some real business case issues, but at the same time address public policy issues that authorities are keen to address, keen to solve for. But I think that at the very basis of this issue is this fragmentation of the ways in which these vehicles are designated across jurisdictions. And even if that were addressed within one jurisdiction, it doesn't really create a broader market for these vehicles and broader market confidence for these operators unless it's really international in scope.
Thanks indeed. A reminder to use the Q&A, the question and answer function, to send us your question. In terms of what we want these actual policies to do, The question is, how can policymakers ensure that vehicle regulations align with desired outcomes rather than being solely defined by vehicle-specific features and characteristics? So how can you have this overarching outcome?
Oh, I was going to say John, but I can start. I think the main outcomes that public authorities are interested in are going to be relating to safety. They're going to be relating to urban space use, and they're going to be relating to the ability for firms to operate efficiently in a territory. And right now, if you look at the current range of regulatory or taxonomical treatments of vehicles, going from a two-wheeled cargo bike, a three-wheeled heavy cargo bike, a four-wheeled heavy cargo bike, a two-wheeled freight motorcycle, a three-wheeled scooter that's motorized with an internal combustion engine, or a larger but smaller than van four-wheel electric vehicle. All of these will have different types of impacts on those issues of safety, environmental performance, and efficiency. And there is no clear way to designate one range of outcomes by linking one specific taxonomical class to that range of outcomes. And so a taxonomy that links specifically to size and speed, for example, is a good way forward. A taxonomy that is linked also to the kind of motorization or the kind of pedal assist that is included in the vehicle design is one way of going forward. But we don't see that happening across cargo bikes and these smaller than van vehicles. And so that means that public authorities are having to cobble together what types of vehicles are the ones that are going to be best able to deliver on the kinds of outcomes, or rather, how can they facilitate what vehicles that are in line with the outcomes that they want? And it's not easy to say, use this class of vehicles. In the report, we highlight that there are moves afoot to try to create these kind of single window classes. One that's been proposed in Germany is the fine mobility approach that uses a very simple method that's based on size, but that correlates very well to the occupation of space and environmental outcomes, and that classifies vehicles from a policy perspective, not from a technical perspective, based on things that we all know: extra small, small, medium, large, XL, and XXL. And this way, this is one way of trying to create some clarity in what types of vehicles are going to be aligned with which outcomes.
Thanks, Philippe. The next question is on related to parcel lockers, which is of course a growing phenomenon. The question goes: given the increasing focus of logistics service providers on out-of-home delivery and promotion and deployment of automated parcel lockers, is there something like a minimum capacity, like a certain amount of parcels for each vehicle in order to efficiently feed parcel lockers? And the question continues, especially when they are white label. I don't know what white label means. But
these are open-ended, all kinds of operators, DPD, other operators processing parcel lockers. So I think when it comes to parcel lockers, you're talking about a concentrated point where a lot of parcels are going to be delivered and then taken away from. It's a bit like these kind of hubs or shops that are serving as parcel hubs as well. In those cases, it actually makes sense to have a larger vehicle service them, because you're talking about bringing in a lot of vehicles at one point and shooting them to 15, 30 different lockers. Where it becomes complicated is when you have these white label ones and you have many types of operators who are going to bring their vehicle to fill up maybe 5 lockers out of 40 or 10 lockers out of 40. And there you get into these problems with about the size that are linked to the size of the vehicle delivering. But when it comes to bespoke lockers, when we discussed with people in the industry, it seems that seems a better use case for a larger vehicle. It probably should be electrified so that you at least remove the kind of emissions impacts. But that is where size matters. When it comes to delivering to shops in dense urban areas without taking up a lot of space, without contributing to a lot of emissions, a large 2- or 3-wheeled cargo bike probably makes more sense if there is a hubbing facility that's available. But that hubbing facility itself can be fed and serviced by a larger vehicle. And in fact, the very cover of our report shows a on-the-street hub that is where a larger van is servicing a smaller three-wheeled cargo bike, and that shows the best uses for each of those. The van brings the parcels into a central point, and the cargo bike delivers those parcels to their final delivery in this case, a very dense urban setting. I know it because I took that photo, and it's not easy to get around that town with a van.
Thanks indeed, Philippe. There's a quick poll in your Zoom window just to let us know how you find these sessions useful. We have another question, of an anonymous question again, which says that following Bruno Latour's idea that containers, as may be the most universal standard for freight, are not passive objects, but organizers or stabilizers of global freight, including urban freight, what would it take to industrially and politically ensure light cargo can also be part of this stabilizing core rather than an alternative?
Yeah, so maybe I can start us off on this one. So I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, sort of these large scale sort of containers are the central backbone of a lot of sort of the global logistics chain. But once we come into urban areas, we always have to kind of deconsolidate these larger sort of packages into vans or whatever else it may be. Maybe they're smaller vehicles like we're treating here. So I think they are there, but they're at different stages. So, you know, you need large containers to move across sort of large areas. You come to outside of cities and you have these sort of areas where you can kind of distribute into cities. But I think they can sort of act in combination, even though they're not part of these larger containers. Now, in terms of sort of getting sort of more information and trying to sort of have more vehicles that can fit, if we can have sort of standard size, smaller containers that can be used across different areas and across different countries, this of course would be a very, very sort of positive outcome, because then what you could do is you can have these smaller containers that you can break out from these larger containers and have this sort of in a much more standardized sort of way. This would be a large sort of improvement in trying to kind of organize how this last mile happens with these smaller vehicles. Philippe?
Yeah, I just point out that at least in Europe, there is the Euro pallet, which is a sectionable freight unit that does fit into a 20-foot and 40-foot container as you go higher up, and it's also something that can be broken down into smaller and smaller type of not parcels, but load carrying containers. What we see is that a lot of parcels are not being fit into palletized containers for the final delivery. But what we do see is that food delivery, for example, grocery deliveries, are fit into these kinds of standardized containers. And so in the last mile logistics task, we see already the penetration of some of those standardized pallets, but not for parcels. And that's probably because there's a wider range of parcel sizes that are going to be involved, from the very small, from clothing type parcels to somewhat larger parcels that might not fit into one of these standardized containers.
Thank you both. I think we've got time for just one more question. Again, an anonymous question, which asks, are simulation tools used as a shared common language between operators and policymakers, so everybody is aligned on the same objectives and trade-offs?
Yeah, I can start off.
Both
As far
sides of the
as
argument.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, it's not used particularly efficiently in lots of places. There's communication. There's still a lot of friction between private actors and policymakers. However, sort of if we want to have sort of efficient freight deliveries in our cities, like data deployment is sort of the foundation for urban freight planning. And I think sort of we need local authorities to overcome sort of a lot of the challenges in terms of how they're asking for data from the companies, but also companies need to adapt and they need to update their data sharing policies so they can really create an environment where we can have outcomes to support both policy aims of these authorities, but also sort of the economic interests of these private actors. Because it really, if they're working together, I think it can be for the best because they understand their business a lot better, but their business interests may not always align specifically with policy outcomes. That's where the policy comes in, because they have to sort of ensure that both of these things are aligned. So yeah, data is key. There's a lot of work to be done there though, still.
I'll just add that the ITF really believes in the ability for this kind of modeling to deliver insights, and John's a bit modest, but he's led a lot of our efforts looking at how freight and logistics ecosystems can be modeled in urban areas, and we use that in support of a lot of our policy recommendations and reports, most recently the freight space race and many of our transport outlooks.
Thank you indeed. A little note in your window, we're going to wrap up. It's 3 o'clock Paris time. Our ITF annual summit is happening a little earlier this year, about 2 weeks earlier, in the beginning of May. Registration is opening this week, so this is the main transport policy event worldwide. We'd be delighted if you could join us. You can find all the information on our website and ask for an invitation if you feel like coming. And to stay in tune with, up to date with what's happening, please follow our newsletters and our LinkedIn channel, where you can find more of this content. So thank you very much, Sarah, John, and Philippe, for a wonderful report and a great presentation and a great session. And thank you to all our participants.